Everyone thinks they know Henry VIII, the bloated Tudor king with 6 unlucky wives, the man who tore England away from the Pope just so he could get a divorce, the monarch with a knack for executions and an appetite for drama. That's the version you get in textbooks, history classrooms, and cheap Halloween costumes. But the truth is far worse. This wasn't just a tyrant with a crown. This was a rotting, festering, paranoid creature trapped in a collapsing body. Henry VIII didn't just rule from a throne, he leaked pus into it. His leg wounds were so infected they oozed continuously, emitting a stench that made courtiers gag. His body became so bloated, his coffin eventually exploded from the pressure of decomposing flesh. Servants were reportedly paid extra just to bear the unbearable smell of being near him. And his mind ravaged by trauma, disease, and likely madness. This isn't just a story about royalty, it's a slow-motion horror film, historical, grotesque, and absolutely real. You're about to discover the secrets your history teacher couldn't stomach, what really happened to Henry VIII, and how power, gluttony, and disease tore a king apart from the inside out. His body was a walking disaster. Henry VIII was once the embodiment of Renaissance manhood. Athletic, handsome, glowing with health and vigor. He jousted, hunted, danced, but that was before the accident. At age 44, Henry suffered a brutal jousting injury that knocked him unconscious for 2 hours. A horse crushed his leg, ripping muscle, cracking bone, and creating an open wound that would become his lifelong torment. But it gets worse. That wound never healed, never. Instead, it became a pus-seeping crater that doctors tried and failed to fix. They cut into it repeatedly, trying to drain the corruption. Each time they made it worse. The wound would scab, swell, split open, and pour foul-smelling discharge. This leg, this single rotting leg, would define the last 15 years of Henry's life. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but modern medical historians believe Henry likely suffered from chronic osteomyelitis, a bone infection that causes decay, systemic fever, and unbearable pain. Others suggest deep venous thrombosis or even diabetes. But what's certain is this: Henry became infected not just in body, but in soul. The king, once proud and statuesque, now had to be carried upstairs by a mechanical hoist. His size ballooned to over 300 pounds. The odor followed him like a shadow. A French ambassador once wrote home, noting the unbearable stink of his person. Imagine that, England's supreme ruler, a man worshipped like a god, trailing a cloud of rot behind him. The wives had it even worse than you think. You know the rhyme: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. It's a catchy way to remember the fates of Henry's 6 wives, but it hides the nightmare. Catherine of Aragon, his first queen, was banished and humiliated after decades of loyalty. Forced to live in isolation, forbidden from seeing her own daughter, she died alone, possibly of a broken heart. Anne Boleyn, his second, met the executioner's blade after being accused of adultery, incest, and treason. Her real crime? Not giving birth to a male heir. Historians today widely agree that the charges were fabricated. But here's the truly horrifying part. By the time of Anne Boleyn's death, Henry's personality had changed dramatically. He'd become irritable, suspicious, and emotionally violent. Some historians believe the jousting accident caused a traumatic brain injury, altering his ability to regulate impulse and emotion. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but neurologists suggest Henry's paranoia and cruelty may stem from damage to the frontal lobe, especially if compounded by untreated infections or genetic disorders like McLeod syndrome. That might explain the terrifying switch from charming courtier to execution-happy despot. Jane Seymour, the one who gave him a male heir, died just days after childbirth, likely from postnatal sepsis. Henry called her his true wife because she died before disappointing him. And Anne of Cleves escaped relatively unscathed. Henry claimed she looked nothing like her portrait and divorced her. That was the kindest ending anyone got. Catherine Howard? She was just a teenager when Henry, now obese, oozing, and nearly immobile, took her as his wife. When she was caught with another man, she was dragged screaming to the executioner. Screaming, and she was only around 17. Catherine Parr, the survivor, spent most of her marriage nursing Henry and dodging religious inquisition charges. She survived, but just barely. Picture this: a procession of women, young, brilliant, terrified, forced to orbit a decaying sun. One by one, they were burned, bled, or beheaded in the name of power, fertility, and royal pride. His eating habits were absolutely insane. Henry VIII didn't just eat. He consumed, devoured, gorged. His meals were epic in scale, feasts designed to showcase wealth but also to fill the black hole that had become his appetite. At the height of his indulgence, the king was eating upwards of 5,000 calories a day. day, not including alcohol. Roasted swans, entire legs of mutton, eel pies, sugared fruits, endless tarts, venison pasties. Each meal was a grotesque performance, and it wasn't just for sustenance, it was about dominance. The court watched as he tore into his food, chewing with yellowing teeth, meat grease dripping into his beard. But it gets worse. As his health declined, Henry's appetite only grew more monstrous. Unable to exercise and barely able to walk, he ballooned to over 320 pounds. His face swelled, his neck vanished, his waistline required armor nearly 4 feet around. And still, he kept eating. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but his excessive protein intake mixed with a lack of fiber likely led to chronic constipation and kidney dysfunction. Modern analysis of his diet shows a high likelihood of type 2 diabetes, gout, and possibly Cushing's syndrome, a condition that causes fat deposits, mood swings, and hormonal imbalance. Food became both comfort and curse, and the court, they were required to feast with him or risk his wrath. Imagine a banquet hall filled with the smell of decaying flesh from his leg, mixing with the scent of roasted boar and mulled wine. Now imagine trying to eat, knowing that your host, the king, might have someone beheaded by dessert. A mind ruled by madness. Henry's descent wasn't just physical, it was mental. The confident, scholarly prince who once wrote love songs and theological essays was gone. What remained was a suspicious, unstable, and volatile tyrant, one who heard plots in whispers and saw betrayal in every glance. He began executing trusted advisors at the drop of a hat. Thomas More, beheaded. Thomas Cromwell, beheaded. Friends turned victims overnight. But here's the truly horrifying part. He had people tortured, burned, stretched, mutilated, just for rumors. Anyone who questioned his supremacy, even indirectly, risked death. He dissolved monasteries, crushed the opposition, and ruled not by love or respect, but by fear. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but modern historians believe Henry may have suffered from multiple undiagnosed mental illnesses. The combination of head trauma, chronic pain, and diseases like syphilis, which some researchers suspect he may have had, could result in dementia, psychosis, and severe paranoia. By the end, Henry was issuing decrees that contradicted his previous laws. He changed his will repeatedly. He barely trusted anyone, including his own children. At one point, he even declared that Elizabeth and Mary were illegitimate, only to later reverse the decision. Picture a king wrapped in furs, trembling with rage, ranting to ghosts in candlelight. That was Henry in his final years. More beast than man, more tyrant than monarch. Treason, torture, and paranoia. As his body rotted and his mind fractured, Henry's obsession with treason turned lethal. He created an atmosphere where even silence could be fatal. The Treasons Act was expanded to include verbal slights, hypothetical questions, even jokes. Servants who muttered complaints were dragged to the Tower. Nobles who hesitated before answering were interrogated, flayed, or burned. A single wrong word could mean death, and no one was safe. But it gets worse. Henry began turning on his own family. His cousin Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, an elderly noblewoman, was executed in a grisly spectacle. Her death was so brutal that it took multiple strikes of the axe to finish her. She didn't kneel quietly, she ran. The executioner chased her down. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but Margaret's execution is considered one of the worst miscarriages of royal justice in English history. Even her jailers admitted there was no real evidence of treason. She died simply because Henry couldn't stand the possibility of opposition. This was the climate of Henry's court. Every smile could be fake, every ally a traitor, every friend a ghost tomorrow. By the time of his death, Henry had ordered the execution of approximately 57,000 people. That's more than any other English monarch. His reign was stained with blood, paranoia, and fear. Imagine living in a palace where the chandeliers gleamed, the food overflowed, the music played, and yet every shadow might hide your doom. Death couldn't stop the chaos. Even in death, Henry VIII refused to go quietly. His passing should have marked the end of an era, but what unfolded was an epilogue ripped from the pages of a Gothic nightmare. His body, bloated from years of disease and decay, refused to rest peacefully. He died on January 28, 1547. His last words were reportedly a whisper of prayer, or perhaps a final command, but the spectacle didn't end there. Here's the truly horrifying part. His corpse had become so swollen, so pressurized with gases from internal rot, that by the time the funeral procession reached Sion Abbey, the coffin had begun to rupture. The wooden casket cracked open, slowly at first, then violently. The royal body literally burst. Fluid and matter spilled from the seams, soaking through to the church floor. The stench was unbearable. Hey, you don't learn this in history classes out there, but this gruesome event was so infamous that it became legend. Chronicler Edward Hall recorded that the liquefied remains seeped onto the floor, and a stray dog was seen licking up the mess. Whether myth or horrifying fact, the symbolism was unforgettable. The king who once saw himself as divine, reduced to meat and bile on holy ground. Think about that image. A once mighty monarch exploded, attendants scrambling in horror, the sacred stones of the abbey stained with royal fluids, a hound, casual, oblivious, lapping at the king's remains. Even nature didn't fear him anymore. By the time they buried him beside Jane Seymour in St. George's Chapel, the myth of Henry VIII had already begun to rewrite itself. The textbooks would polish the crown, summarize the legacy, downplay the horror. But the real Henry, he was a creature of contradictions, majestic and monstrous, brilliant and broken, a king who rewrote religion and slaughtered those he once loved, a man whose body betrayed him, whose mind turned on him, and whose death refused dignity. Henry VIII wasn't just a tyrant, he was a warning. They called him a Renaissance king, a warrior, a reformer, but by the end, he was something else entirely, a decaying tyrant sealed inside a mountain of meat, hallucinating betrayals, soaked in sweat and blood, dying slowly under the weight of his own crown. So now you tell me, was Henry VIII a monster? Or just a man consumed, devoured by power, pain, and pride? If you want to uncover more of history's forgotten horrors, stories so dark they blur the line between fact and fable, subscribe now, because what they don't teach in school is the stuff nightmares are made of. Next time, we'll descend into the shadowed halls of another infamous ruler, one whose crimes were hidden behind silk curtains, whispers, and poison. History doesn't sleep, and neither should you.